Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a video where I'm basically going to be covering what you can start doing right now if you want to prepare for 3.0. A lot of the teams that are going to become good once Dendro comes out are going to be relying on stuff that you can't farm right now. You can't farm the EM artifact set, you can't farm the Dendro artifact set. So I figured I'd make a video where I basically just cover the different archetypes that we'll have in Dendro, and based on the different archetypes that you're interested in playing, what you can start farming right now, how you should be spending your Risen right now if you want to prepare for it, and basically get those teams ready to go as soon as possible once the 3.0 patch comes around. Just like everything else in this video, like if we get news of the beta or whatever and this becomes outdated, I'll leave that in the pinned comment, so make sure that like you're checking the pinned comment before like actually taking my advice from the video, because it's possible that something's changed. We're gonna start with the most straightforward one, which is the Aggravate Teams. In Aggravate Teams, you'll basically end up playing a Dendro unit. It won't necessarily have to be Dendro main character. If you are planning on playing Dendro MC, you can already, farm levels for Dendro MC. If you are planning on using Dendro MC in Aggravate Teams, then a decent portion of their damage is going to be coming from spread. By the way, a quick overview. As far as Aggravate Teams are concerned, the main reactions you're triggering are Quicken, Spread, and Aggravate. So Quicken is Electro plus Dendro. It puts the enemy in a quickened state. So when an enemy is quickened, applying Electro to them triggers Aggravate, which deals more damage, and applying Dendro to them triggers Spread, which deals more damage. And neither of those reactions remove Quicken, so you can keep Quicken on them as long as you want. So effectively, once you've quickened, all of your Electro and Dendro attacks that apply an element will deal more damage. So your Dendro character, your Dendro MC, will be doing more damage based on spread, and spread damage scales pretty well with character level. So if you're planning on having your Dendro main character in an Aggravate team, leveling them right now is actually relatively valuable. It's something you can do to prep. If you're planning on using Technati or Kole, you can't level them yet. If you are planning on building your Technati, your Kole, or your Dendro main character, they're generally going to be wanting a Dendro goblet. And right now we can't have Dendro goblets, but we will be able, most likely, I fucking hope so, to get Dendro goblets once 3.0 comes around. So what you can do right now is you can hoard artifacts, right? If you get a +0 artifact that's fucking dog shit, don't feed it into another artifact. Stick to 4-star artifacts for leveling your other artifacts. And then your 5-star artifacts that are pretty bad, like for example something like this, on the first day of 3.0 you'll be able to use this in the strong box, and as far as we understand, you should be able to get Dendro damage goblets from the strong box. I guess you can also do it, I don't have any right now, but with the chamber rewards from Abyss, if you haven't gotten the ones from this one, or like you can keep the ones from the next one, right? Because you do get those domain reliquary. Those can also potentially be Dendro gauntlets, but yeah. So let's move on to the rest of the team. So most Aggravate teams are gonna be using Fischl. Not all of them will. In my Quicken video, I have kind of only focused on Aggravate teams that use Fischl. There will be other teams that that don't use Fischl. I can see, for example, Raiden with Yaimiko or Raiden with Kuki being potential options that you can do. But I do think that almost every Aggravate teams will end up using Fischl. So unless you're basically specifically planning on making a Raiden team and you don't want to use Fischl in your Raiden team, then if you're planning on playing Aggravate teams, leveling Fischl is something you should do. On top of that, we can actually take a look at the set bonuses that she can have. As you can see from this, it really looks like Thundersoother is the best set for Fischl. Thundersoother has a condition, and you won't always have the condition, so we'll actually explain when and when it isn't good. But let's start with the other sets. So the 4-piece Gilded Dreams set here, the reason why it's not doing too hot is because we're using Sucrose in these assumptions. If we are to remove Sucrose from the assumptions, remove the 200-ish EM we get from Sucrose, it actually makes the 4-piece Gilded Dreams a closer to Thundersoother and relatively above the other options. But that being said, it's also important to remember that the Gilded Dreams set has a trigger condition, and it won't always be active. And because it's not always active, then you don't actually get all of this. It's on Fischl, because she is applying Electro a lot, it'll be active like probably 95% of the time. But that still means that there's a small part of your damage that won't benefit from it. So in practice, it's gonna be a little tiny little bit lower than this. But the main reason I wanted to show this is because the 4-piece Gilded Dreams set is good. It gives you a lot of stats. But the stats that it gives you are elemental mastery and attack percent. And those are not the best stats for aggravate units. Aggravate units care about damage percent and then about crit a lot more than they care about EM or attack. Because they care about EM and they care about attack, but EM only increases your aggravate damage and attack only increases your talent damage. Whereas damage and crit increase all your damage. So in the case of those units, generally getting sets that gives you damage bonus is more valuable than getting sets that give you elemental mastery. The problem with the Thundering Fury set is that sure, it gives you damage bonus and that's cool and all, but it's only 15. So sure, it's the stat you want, but it's not a lot of the stat. And then the 4-piece bonus gives you a 20% damage to your aggravates, which is basically just effectively a bit of EM. That being said, because in a lot of teams you'll end up actually stacking a lot of EM on your Fischl and on your other aggravate units, either directly with EM substat weapons or EM sands, or indirectly with external buffs like Sucrose. Then TF is going to be generally either very close behind or very slightly better. But most importantly, TF has the advantage of being a set you can farm right the fuck now, which is nice. But then on top of that, TF also has the advantage of reducing your skill cooldown whenever you trigger a reaction with a cooldown of 0.8 seconds. Triggering such effects decreases elemental skill cooldown by 1 second. Now, from what we understand, they're adding Aggravate to this list, which means Fischl will be able to proc it. However, what it doesn't say here, but what is implied, is that this does not work off-field, which means you're not going to get a 12-second cooldown skill because you're triggering a lot of aggravates, unless your Fischl stays on field. But you don't want your Fischl to stay on field, so effectively, you're not actually gaining much value out of it. That being said, 25-second cooldown is a bit of a pain in the ass in a lot of teams. If you look at most units that you play in aggravate teams, you look at Dendro main character, cooldown is 20-second on the burst. You look at Sucrose, 20-second cooldown. You look at Kazuha, 15-second cooldown. Beidou, 20-second cooldown. So, there's gonna be some aggravate teams where, sure, Fischl isn't proccing the set a lot, but she can proc it 2 or 3 times in your rotation. And proccing it 2 or 3 times in your rotation means that you can actually reliably make your rotation a 22 or 23-second rotation instead of being forced to stick to 25 because of her E. It's a very minor upside. In practice, it won't make too much of a difference, but it is another thing that's worth considering. If the TF damage was very far behind the other sets, I would not recommend this. But because it is very similar, then getting 4-piece TF is actually good. Now, I want to talk about 4-piece Thundersoother. 4-piece Thundersoother works on enemies that are applied with Electro. So how exactly does this work? You can see, my first attack is doing 350, right? And now, can I get a fucking crit? 257. Why is that? My child doesn't have a way to boost damage sometimes, and neither does he, which means we got the Dragon's Bane passive. Even though the enemy is frozen, I can still get the Dragon's Bane passive when there's a Hydro under there. From what we understand, Electro with Quicken also works like this. Which means that you'll trigger Quicken, but then you'll be able to apply Electro under the Quicken. And because you have Electro under the Quicken, when you attack an enemy, well, they have Electro on them, so you should be able to get Thundersoother. However, once they have Electro on them, if you reapply Dendro, what happens? Well, it removes it, right? Applying Dendro triggers Quicken, so that removes the Electro. But because Fischl's elemental application is so goddamn fucking fast, and because in a lot of the aggravate teams that we'll see, you'll actually be running 2 Electro characters, you'll be able to re-trigger aggravate almost immediately and put an Electro in there again. And on top of that, the Dendro characters we have pretty terrible Dendro application, with the exception of Ternari, which means that you can actually expect decent uptime on Thundersoother. It's not going to be 100%, right? So this damage percent isn't actually going to be 35%. It's more going to be something like maybe 80% uptime, but it's still better. Your uptime has to become actually pretty bad for it to be worse than the other sets, right? Even at 70%, it's about the same. But the main reason why this is relevant isn't just because, well, you should be farming for Thundersoother. So Thundersoother has its advantages, but it is conditional, and sometimes you might be fighting enemies where you can't apply an underlying Electro. Point being, you are still adding a condition to your team, which is not ideal. It's always, if two sets are equal, it's always better to go with the one that doesn't have a condition than the one that does. But the reason why it's relevant that Thundersoother is at the very least a good option is because Thundersoother is in the same domain as TF, which means that effectively, whereas for most people, the TF domain is like, well, I don't know if I want to farm it because it's not that resin efficient, right? I only want one of the two sets. Well, now, both sets are good. You can use either of the sets in your Aggravate teams. Generally, you'll have a unit that might want TF. For example, if you're using Kutsing as your on-fielder, Kutsing really does want to get the TF set for the effect because it's very relevant. But then you can have Kutsing on TF and Fischl on Thundersoother. You can effectively be more resin efficient in your farming because Thundersoother is at the very least a viable option. There will be units that want the new Gilded Dreams set. For example, Yaemiko with her passive that increases her damage percent based on EM doesn't just get the aggravate damage from her EM, she also gets more damage percent, which makes set like Gilded Dreams gain some value. So for a character like Yaemiko, you might actually want to hold off until you actually get the Gilded Dreams set. Most other Electro characters, though, don't actually synergize with EM as a baseline, which means that TF and TS are both also very solid sets. There is, however, going to be an exception-ish. So I want to talk about Beidou. The thing about Beidou is because all of her damage comes from her burst, well, the emblem set gives her a lot of damage percent. So I can actually compare like a 4-piece Thundering Fury to a 4-piece emblem. And this is going to be TF. And your overall DPS comes out at quite a bit, relatively significantly better with Emblem. And then that's without even counting the additional ER you get from the Emblem set, which means that you won't need to get as much ER, which means you'll be able to focus more on offensive stats. You'll actually get even more damage than this. So basically, if a character deals like most of their damage with their burst, Emblem can still very much be their best set. You look at someone like Raiden as well, Raiden would also want to stick with Emblem. But for the other characters, Thundering Fury and Thundersoother are both very viable sets, so if you're considering playing them and you want to start getting ahead right now, you want to start farming for them right now, you can always go for the Thundering Fury domain. In your Quicken Teams, right, you'll have your Dendro, you'll have your generally Fischl, and then what you really want is you want an Anemo character, because, well, your Electro characters deal Electro damage, and you can increase your Electro damage by using the Viridescent Venom set and reducing the enemy's resistances. So you want to use something like either Sucrose or Kazuha. Now, in Aggravate Teams, at a baseline, Kazuha will actually be offering more because what makes Sucrose good generally in Vape Teams, for example, is that she gives a lot of EM and a lot of attack. But like we said earlier, EM and attack aren't as valuable as damage percent in Aggravate Teams. So at a baseline, Kazuha will give more. However, that won't always be the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Beidou, and this time instead of comparing Emblem to TF, we're going to be comparing Sucrose to Kazuha. But as you can see, it's still not more. And the reason for that is because, sure, Sucrose gives EM bonus, but in Aggravate Teams, you only have one element that can be absorbed with Sucrose's burst. Usually, it's pretty hard to make sure that your Sucrose burst infuses the right element because, well, its pickup range is really weird and sometimes it just will infuse the wrong shit. But in Aggravate Teams, you have Electro, you have Anemo, you have Dendro. Dendro can't be infused, Anemo can't be absorbed, sorry. Anemo can't be absorbed, it's only Electro. Which means that if you have a C6 Sucrose, you can actually very reliably get Sucrose's damage bonus. But then on top of that, this is assuming you're on Sacrificial Fragments. Because personally, that's generally what I'll be running. I mean, it's more energy, it's more grouping, I really like it. But it's not the only weapon you can use in these teams. You can also use Hakushin Ring. If you do end up using Hakushin Ring, and you get the C6 Burst Infusion, she actually gives more damage percent than Kazuha does. She gives 40% damage percent. In order for your Kazuha to give 40% damage percent, he needs to have 1000 EM. Most Kazuhas won't, and even if your Kazuha does get to 1000 EM because you have incredibly good artifacts, Sucrose also gives an EM buff as a baseline. She doesn't give as much if she's not using Sac Frag, 40 less, but it's still an EM buff. Now, the only situation where this isn't as good is if, for example, you aren't actually getting the C6 bonus. You don't have C6 maybe, or your burst doesn't infuse, whatever. Then the damage becomes a lot closer. So you might be seeing this and be like, oh, well, I guess that means Sucrose is just better than Kazuha in Aggravate Teams, right? But the reality is that's not necessarily the case. While Sucrose definitely is very nice in Aggravate Teams, she does not have as much personal damage as Kazuha does. Kazuha gets more swirls overall. Overall, right, Kazuha's personal damage is higher than Sucrose's. All in all, Kazuha and Sucrose effectively fulfill the same function in Aggravate Teams, with each of them having their own set of advantages and disadvantages. I think overall they're both really good. However, if you are spending field time on one of them, if for example, your units are like Dendro DMG, Fischl, Beidou, and you're looking for a last slot, Sucrose or Kazuha would stay on field. And if they are staying on field, Sucrose is a lot better. Because there's no double swirl setups, in Aggravate Teams you only have one element to swirl, so it's a lot easier to figure it out. So it's really more of the straightforward, like, what do you want? Do you want Sucrose's ability to group units while off field with her burst? Because you're playing something like, I don't know, Raiden, whatever, and you don't want the enemies to just fly away? Is your Raiden so invested that you're gonna fucking kill them with one slash anyways? So getting them grouped more tightly with Kazuha would be more valuable. Or maybe you need an on-field unit because you're not using Raiden, you're using like Beidou Fischl or Beidou Cookie, and you don't know what you do once all your bursts are on the field, like who are you auto-attacking with? Well, in that case, maybe you'll want to go for Sucrose. Another option that is actually going to be pretty okay as well is actually running both. Because what you can do here is you can use Thundering Fury on Kazuha and have him as the on-field unit. And with Thundering Fury, he gets his E very often. You effectively get it every 3 to 4 seconds instead of every 6 seconds. Because from what we understand, Aggravate can proc the Thundering Fury set, and Electro swirls in AoE can aggravate, which means that you'll be able to get procs off the set with Kazuha. So that's another thing that you can consider. If you are doing TF Kazuha, Sucrose isn't your only option. You can also go over something like Venti if you want better grouping. Sucrose is generally going to be better outside of the grouping because she gives an EM buff and she can have a Hakushin. Generally, she'll just give your team more stuff than Venti does. But Venti does have the energy refund for Fischl, which can be actually pretty useful because she's solo Electro in this team. Anyways, point being, both Kazuha and Sucrose have value in Aggravate Teams. Another nice thing about TF Kazuha with Sucrose is that Sucrose knocks up, Kazuha knocks up, and then when he does his plunge attack, the vortex sucks back down. And so you can actually get instances of fall damage on light enemies, which can be pretty nice. Another thing that I haven't mentioned and that I should mention is Heizou is also a very potentially valuable character in Aggravate Teams as an on-field driver with, for example, Dendro DMG, Beidou Fischl. Now, obviously, unlike Sucrose, his grouping is very lackluster, but if you're against enemies where you don't actually need the grouping, something like, I don't know, Chamber 2 right now, Chamber 2-2, then going Heizou is actually pretty relevant. Now, let's move on to the next team. So, if you are planning on using a team that relies on the Bloom reactions, Bloom is Hydro plus Dendro. It creates a seed on the ground, and then you can either wait, in which case that seed is going to expire after 6 seconds, I think, or you can trigger more Blooms, which means that you'll get more seeds, and there's a limit of 5 seeds, so if you get a 6th seed, the oldest one will explode as well. Or what you can do is you can apply an element to the seeds, either Electro or Pyro, to trigger the sub-reactions that Bloom has, so Hyperbloom with Electro, or Burgeon with Pyro. So effectively, Bloom, if you let the seed expire or you generate more, you'll do AoE damage that's about the same as Overload. If you trigger Burgeon, it's the exact same thing, but the damage is 1.5 times Overload instead of the same as Overload. And then Hyperbloom is the same damage as Burgeon, so 1.5 times Overload, but instead of it being AoE, it's a projectile that's single target. So you'll have a few possible things that you can do with those teams, but at least the archetypes that I can see being potentially good are base Hyperbloom teams, base Burgeon teams, Bloom teams, and Quick-Bloom teams. So what I mean by Quick-Bloom is effectively that you can use Quicken and Bloom in the same team, potentially. Obviously, you'll have an Electro, so you'll trigger Hyperbloom, but the point is that you'll get that Bloom stuff. So why is it relevant? As far as we understand, when you trigger Hydro on Dendro, it doesn't actually remove all of the Dendro. It's a 0.5 times, just like when you apply Pyro on Hydro or Cryo on Pyro in Melt and Vaporize. So if I do Kea E into Bennett E, it removes all the element. If I do it the other way around, there's still some Pyro left on the enemy for another reaction. Reactions have sides, and there's some sides that consume more aura, and sometimes that consume less. Hydro and Dendro consumes less. And the reason why that's very relevant is because when you trigger Quicken, it's not really a buff like Superconduct. It's a lot closer to something like Freeze, where, sure, the enemy will have the debuff on them, but the debuff will be an aura, and you can react with that debuff to potentially remove it. If you apply, for example, Pyro to that Quicken, it will burn, and you will lose Quicken. If you apply Hydro to that debuff, it will bloom, but because Hydro and Dendro is a 0.5 times side and not a 1 times or 2 times side, it won't actually remove all of it. It will just remove most of it, just like when we did Bennett E into Kaya E. We still had some Pyro left. So if you do that, you're not actually removing your Quicken. You'll need to apply Hydro one additional time to remove Quicken. So in other words, as long as you're reapplying Dendro fast enough that you don't apply Hydro twice in a row, you don't actually lose Quicken. Which means that you'll basically be able to use Hydro units with slow Hydro application to generate blooms for your Electro units to Hyperbloom without actually losing Quicken. So that your Electro units will be able to both Hyperbloom and Aggravate. In order to do that, you have to use slow Hydro application units. So it will be mostly for Kokomi. You'll also be able to use it with Mona or Barbara, but obviously those units' Hydro application isn't as reliable as Kokomi's, so generally Kokomi will be better. And here I'm talking about off-field Kokomi, not on-field Kokomi. So you'll have teams like that trigger both Quicken and Hyperbloom, and I just decided to call it Quick-Bloom because it's very self-explanatory what Quick-Bloom is. It's Quicken and Hyperbloom. In your Quick-Bloom teams, you'll need a Dendro unit, obviously. You'll need a Hydro unit, but you want it to be something like Kokomi with slow Hydro. I don't have Kokomi, so I'll be using Barbara. And then what you want is an Electro unit. Now, you want to have Electro units that are good in Quicken, but that can also trigger Hyperbloom. So you'll want to use units like Fischl still, units like Beidou, you can use Raiden. Now the big problem here is that for your last slot, right, you're an Aggravate team, so you do want to have an Anemo on the last slot, which can be okay, but it's also important to remember that if your Anemo unit triggers Electro Swirl, which you can on Quicken enemies with underlying Electro, they can actually proc the seeds themselves. And that's actually the ideal situation, because this is still a subtype of an Aggravate team, right? So your Electro units still want damage percent, and they still want crit. They don't want to only build EM. They want some EM, and probably more than usual, because they are going to be triggering some seeds, but ideally, they still want damage percent, and they still want crit. Whereas your Anemo units, because Swirl is just kind of a broken reaction, only want EM. What that means is your Anemo units will have more EM than your Electro units, which means that in a perfect world, your Anemo units are the one to trigger the seeds, not your Electro units. Now, as far as I understand, Fischl will actually have relatively high ownership of Hyperbloom procs for a pretty decent number of them. Not all of them, but a pretty decent number of them. My best guess is that the pickup range that the seeds have for Electro Element is relatively big, which means that even if Fischl isn't targeting it directly, sometimes she'll still be the one to trigger it. The reason why I'm talking about this is because there is an Electro unit that, at least as far as we know so far, doesn't actually do anything to the seeds. And that unit is Beidou. So Beidou's burst, as far as we understand, apart from the initial cast and apart from her skill as well, her burst lightning procs, they don't actually hit the seeds. Which means that if you were to use Beidou here, you'd be able to make sure that Sucrose has sole ownership of Hyperbloom. Now, the problem with a team like this is that you're running solo Electro Beidou. I'm gonna need more energy recharge. If we look at the actual amount that you'll need, right, we can actually calculate. You really do not need a lot of ER in Taser teams. But the reason for that is because you're getting Fischl particle and Electro Resonance particles. In Quick-Bloom teams, you have one Electro and it's Beidou, which means that your ER requirements are around 180. But this is relatively optimistic. If, for example, you don't get a perfect parry at all, and you get unlucky and you don't actually get your Dendro MC's Favonius weapon to proc, you don't get a crit, it goes up to 240. My point is, here, it's a lot of energy recharge, which kind of sucks. But it's not an unrealistic amount of energy recharge. If we remember what we said earlier, Beidou wants to be on Emblem. Going an ER sense on an Emblem Beidou, you don't have an attack sense anymore, but you do have the ER, but the attack sense isn't that valuable to begin with because we're in an Aggravate team, and the ER sense still does give you some damage percent because of the Emblem passive. So the difference in damage is actually not as big as you might actually expect. So let's take a look. This is attack sense, this is ER sense. And the actual damage difference is about 14%, which obviously is a lot, but it's not a massive amount. So, all this to say, Beidou and Quick-Bloom teams is going to be a viable option. She might not necessarily be the best, but you shouldn't just discount it all like instantly just because it's solo Electro Beidou, and that means she's going to need more ER. Because there is an upside to that. There is the upside that she's not going to steal your Hyperblooms and that Sucrose will be getting them instead. Anyways, when it comes to those Quick-Bloom teams, what you really want is you want your Electro and your Anemo characters to be level 90. Your Anemo character is going to want to be on VV basically no matter what, so you can already farm that if you haven't already. Your Electro character, if it's Beidou, will want to stick to Emblem. If it's not Beidou, you can wait until the patch to farm for the new EM set, because other Electro characters will be stealing some Hyperblooms, which effectively makes the value of EM on them a little bit better. So the Hydro character is just going to want to be built like they are right now. In Kokomi's case, she's not actually spending time on field, which means that Clam isn't that good on her. TOM will generally be better, but honestly they're both okay because the attack bonus isn't as valuable in Aggravate Teams as it is in other teams. But she won't really be spending any time on field attacking unless you just really need the healing. So it's fine if she's not on like a specific set. And then your Dendro character is probably going to want to be on the Dendro resistance shred set because Hyperbloom is Dendro damage, so you want someone on that set, which is also another set that's coming in 3.0. Also, your Hydro character does not need to be level 90 for this. Maybe they do want to be level 90 for their damage or for their healing, but they don't need to be level 90 for reactions because they shouldn't be actually the trigger for Hyper. The only reaction they can be the trigger for are like Electro Charge, which ideally you don't get Electro Charge because if you get Electro Charge it means you lost Quicken, or for Bloom, but the Bloom is then going to get Hyperbloom so that your Hydro character's level won't matter. The next archetype is another Hyperbloom, where instead of using a low Hydro App unit to maintain quick enough time, you use a high Hydro App unit to get more Hyperblooms. So in those teams, you're not actually going to get very good aggravate uptimes. For example, if you're using Xingqiu. In these teams, you're not actually going to get very good aggravate uptime, but in exchange, you'll be applying enough Hydro to get, well, more blooms, right? And more blooms means more Hyperblooms. Effectively, you're trading some of your Electro units damage for Hyperblooms. If you do want to go for that, very similarly, right, if you use Beidou, you can build her an EM already, but other Electro units will generally have some ownership of Hyperbloom, which means that you probably build them with a new EM set. Dendro character still on the new Dendro Shred set, and Hydro character just on whatever set they usually use for damage. So you can farm for your Anemo and Hydro, and if your Electro's Beidou, you can farm for her as well. But for other ones, probably better off to hold off until you can actually farm the EM set in 3.0. Next up is Burgeon Teams. Burgeon Teams are basically relying on you triggering Bloom with Hydro and Dendro, and then applying Pyro to it to trigger Burgeon. You'll basically have two main ways that you can play Burgeon Teams. You can either go for as many Burgeon procs as possible, which you could do with double Dendro units. So for example, on-field Kokomi, Dendro MC, Kole, plus like Xiangling or Thoma. In that case, you'd probably rather use Thoma because if you apply too much Pyro, you might accidentally trigger Burning, and triggering Burning is not ideal because it might actually make you lose blooms. So because Thoma triggers Burning less, he gets less Pyro application, maybe you'd rather play him. You can also use an Electro unit as your last slot instead of a second Dendro in order to give your Pyro unit hopefully some overloads on top of their Burgeons, because they're going to be built full EM anyways with a new set, and if they're built full EM then their overload damage is also going to be relatively significant. The other way that you can go about this is instead of doing only like maximizing your Burgeon damage, what you can do is you can actually make sure that you apply so much Hydro that you'll be able to trigger Burgeon and still reapply Hydro so fast that you'll also be able to trigger Vape. So for example, you could use Child with Xiangling with a new EM set with, like, for example, EM damage crit, where Xiangling would be able to get both some Burgeon damage and some Vape damage. Obviously, you'd need a healer with this team, so you could use something like Bennett because he synergizes so well with Xiangling. Another one of the archetypes you could do with this is instead of using a Pyro unit as your trigger, you can actually use an Anemo unit, because Anemo units can swirl Pyro or absorb Pyro in their attacks that absorb elements. So for example, Kazuha, right? Kazuha can use his burst inside of Bennett's burst, which will make it absorb with Pyro even if the enemies don't have Pyro on them. Bennett's burst. Right, none of them has Pyro on them, but I do. So when I cast my Kazuha burst, it infuses with Pyro, and it does do some melts and some Pyro damage and all that. But because it's Pyro infused, it can trigger Burgeon. And because you want to build your Kazuha full EM anyways, then triggering Burgeon is pretty nice. Or you can also use the Sunfire interaction, Bennett plus Jean, where instead of absorbing Pyro onto an ability, Jean's burst applies Anemo to your character, but because Bennett also applies Pyro to your characters, that triggers Pyro Swirl. And if you build your gene with full EM, those swirls that are going to do damage, they can actually double dip into Elemental Mastery because you can actually vape those swirls. Alright, so as you can see, I can make my swirls hit for 18,000 here, right? And then you can get that on top of Burgeons, which can be pretty nice. Now, obviously, you're probably not getting this much EM, you're probably getting a bit less because you need some ER on your gene. Point being, you can also use Anemo characters instead of Pyro characters if you want to trigger Burgeon. You can't really do it well with Hyperbloom because Electro is low in the list of priorities for infusion, and because self-Electro application is basically only doable with Razor, who kind of sucks, and with Dory, who also seems to kind of suck. Anyways, having covered all the types of Burgeon teams you'll have, what sets do you want for that? Well, if you're using a Pyro trigger, you will want them on the new set. The new set is going to be very good for them. If you're using an Anemo unit, you can put them on Viridescent Venom and you can start farming that now. You're also going to need to have your Dendro character on the Dendro set so that they reduce the Dendro resistance. Whatever character is you're using to trigger your Burgeon, whether it's Pyro or Anemo, you want that to be level 90 100% because Burgeon damage scales with level. And then your Hydro character can just be on whatever set you'd normally use on them. So that leaves us with one last team archetype, which is the Fridge Teams, or the Bloom Teams. You don't have to do something with the seeds. You can just leave them there until either they expire or you generate so much that you reach the limit. You'll have your Dendro, you'll have your Hydro. So you can just only focus on generating seeds. So if you do that, you can go for something like double Hydro, double Dendro. The biggest issue with going for something like double Hydro, double Dendro is because Hyperbloom and Burgeon, right, because you can only trigger them with your Electro or Power damage, it's easy to figure out who wants EM. With Bloom, though, it can be either your Dendro or your Hydro character that triggers the Bloom. And so it'll be hard to make sure that only one of them is the one triggering them. And ideally you want it to be only one of them so you can build EM on the one that triggers them and then normal attack, damage, crit stats on the others. That's the ideal scenario. And when you go double Hydro, double Dendro, you're likely going to need to build EM on more than one character, which is generally not what you want to do. So instead, I would generally recommend either going for solo Hydro with you can go double Dendro with an Anemo unit, because the Bloom Seeds can be sucked in by a grouping ability. As far as we know, Bloom Seeds can be sucked in by something like Venti's Burst, so having a way to group enemies and make sure that they're close to the seeds can be pretty valuable. No matter what you do, you'll want the Dendro set on one of your units, and you'll want at least one of your units to be on the EM set because that's what gets you your damage. If you're using an Anemo unit, you want them on VV, and then any units that aren't those, you'll just put on the set that they'd usually use. Anyways, when you're using solo Hydro, it should be relatively easy to make sure that your Hydro unit is always the one triggering Bloom, which means that you'd want your Hydro unit on full EM, and your Dendro units on either the Dendro set or normal damage stuff. When you're using double Hydro, your Dendro unit will always be the one triggering it, which means you'd want your Hydro units on one of the two on the Dendro set, the other one on their normal set, and your Dendro unit on the EM set. If you don't trigger too many Blooms, it is possible that you'd want the Dendro unit to be the one wearing the Dendro set instead, because more of your damage would be coming from the Hydro unit. But finally, we get to the last option, which is Dendro, Hydro, Anemo, and Cryo, because Cryo doesn't react with Dendro. And because Cryo doesn't react with Dendro, it won't fuck your reactions, right? Basically, you'll just be gaining freeze on top of what you already do. But then on top of that, some of the mechanics in the elemental reactions will basically make it so that when you have a Cryo unit, you'll be able to get more blooms. So the way that it works is, I guess I can show it with Bennett, Child, Beidou, and then the editor can probably just put them side by side and give a timer. And as you can see, we did the same thing with Child, right? We only hit him with his E, but the Hydro does last longer. And the reason for that is because you basically have to get through the Electro in order to get to the Hydro. So if you apply more Electro, your Pyro attack will basically be removing less Hydro from the enemy. You'll still be removing some Hydro, but less. And you're still getting Vaporize, you're just removing less aura. You can actually use this exact same mechanic with Bloom, because you can have Cryo and Dendro on an enemy, and when you apply Hydro to that enemy, it'll react with the Cryo first. Which means that when you have Cryo and Dendro, only a small portion of your Hydro actually makes it to your Dendro. In other words, because of your Cryo, your Hydro removes less Dendro, which means that you can get more Blooms without needing more Dendro. In very, very oversimplified terms, Your cold makes your veggies last longer. Your fridge makes your vegetables last longer. That's why it's a mechanic that's been dubbed fridge. But yeah, so by using this mechanic, you'll basically be able to get more blooms without needing more Dendro, which is very valuable because it's not just that you don't need as much Dendro, is that it lets you run a Cryo unit instead of a second Dendro unit. And Cryo units are good, not only because they generally have good baseline stats, but also because they freeze. And when you freeze, you keep enemies frozen, it's a lot easier to make them last in place long enough for your blooms to have time to explode. So freeze is very valuable in Bloom Teams, specifically for that. As far as I understand, as far as I've seen, I don't actually expect Bloom Teams to be all that great in 3.0 because of the Dendro units we have and some of the limitations that those Dendro units have. But I do expect fridge teams to somewhat at least function. So in those teams, you just have your Cryo unit on like Blizzard's Trigger or Emblem if they need the energy. You have your Hydro unit on fully M because they're the ones triggering the bloom. You'll have your Dendro unit on the new Dendro set, and you'd have your Anemo unit if you're using one on Viridescent Venerer. But yeah, that basically does it for the stuff that you can do to prep. So again, right, for those fridge teams, your Cryo and Anemo characters are characters you can farm for right now, and your Dendro and Hydro, you'll have to wait until 3.0. But you can level up your Hydro character to 90 now. And this is, Bloom Teams are the only one of the team archetypes where your Hydro character actually, like, quote unquote, needs to be level 90, because they're the only ones that where your Hydro character is the one whose level is looked at for the damage of your reaction. But yeah, I hope that helps to do it. So TLDR, right? We're gonna go through all the archetypes again, just very, very, very TLDR version. In Quicken Teams, you can farm TF and or Emblem and or Thundersoother and or Viridescent Venerer, depending on which units you're using in your teams. You can level up your characters to 90 if they're triggering Aggravate or Spread or Swirl. And you can consider potentially getting a Hakushin ring if you're using, for example, Sucrose, but you're not using her on field, so Sack doesn't have as much value. For Quick-Bloom Teams, level 90 your Electro and Anemo characters. You don't need to level up to 90 your Hydro characters. Your Electro characters will just want the new EM set, unless they're Beidou. Your Anemo characters want VV. Your Hydro characters want whatever set they would usually run anyways. There's not actually too much you can do to prep for those teams, other than level 90ing your characters. For Hyperbloom Teams, again, level 90 your characters. Don't necessarily need to level 90 your Hydro ones, though. You want to farm for good stats on your Hydro character, because they're going to be a Hydro character that deals damage generally, something like Singsto, something like Yolan, something like Ayato maybe Child, who knows. And you should hold off for farming on your Electro units for their sets, because they're also still probably going to want the new EM set, unless they're Beidou. Burgeon Teams can't farm for your Pyro character set, because it's going to be the EM set, same for the Dendro character, but you can level 90 your Pyro character right now, and your Hydro characters are going to use the same stuff as usual, same for Anemo characters. And finally, in Fridge and Bloom Teams, your Dendro is going to want the Dendro set, your Hydro is going to want the Hydro set. For your Hydro character, you can farm for their levels, you can level them up, and for the rest of your team, you can farm what you would usually farm. Viridescent Venerer if it's Anemo, level 90, or if it's Cryo, Blizzard's Trigger, or Emblem, talent levels, stuff like that. But yeah, so that does it. I'm really looking forward to Sumeru. I'm looking forward to Dendro. That's what I'm looking forward to. Again, 3.0 patch day. I'm gonna try to do a 24-hour stream, so hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you for dropping by. Yeah, I'll see you guys around. Goodbye, YouTube.